Welcome to the Vale
Matters
podcast, brought to you by Evesham Notice Board Group.
We will explore topics from local politics and economy to education and events dedicated to Evesham, Pershore and Broadway.
We will also feature stories from everyday people to learn about their experiences and get a better understanding of how our community is changing.
So join us.
Let's talk about the things that matter in the Vale.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to episode 16 of the Vale Matters podcast. And it's a very special episode today because for the first time we've come out of the studio and we are on location here at Hampton Ferry with our very special guest Diana Raphael, who was born here and has lived here for almost her entire life. During that time, she's witnessed enormous changes, served as mayor twice, and recently written a book, Living Next to Paradise, all about her life. So, Diana, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you here. I'm sure we're going to have an enormous amount to talk about. I don't know how we're going to fit it all in because I've read your book and I absolutely loved it, which is why as soon as I'd finished, I got straight on to invite you on. So we'll begin, as we always do. We have a few quick fire questions, which are quite light-hearted. So we'll begin with that. So firstly, asparagus, broccoli or carrots?
Asparagus.
Yes.
Every time.
Yeah. Asparagus always wins that question. Okay. Now, I know you've travelled a lot, so I came up with this one. Train, boat or plane?
Bit of both, but mostly plain.
Mostly plane. Well, it is faster.
Yes.
But
it's further to go.
Yes.
Long time to go by train to Australia.
Yes.
Or the likes of.
Yes, if you even could. Yeah. So, okay. And finally, what's your favourite season? Winter, spring, summer or autumn?
Used to be winter.
Which we are now in.
Which we're now in.
Yeah.
Now that I'm in it and not working, I don't think it is anymore because I don't like the grey days. But I used to love it. At the end of the season that we have here, my husband's idea of bliss was an empty car park, so that we were here on our own and quiet, and we loved.
And you could relax.
Yes, and the dark nights and the winter, we had more time to ourselves than we do, or that we ever did. Sort of spring and summer.
Indeed.
And the autumn sort of fails out. I'm afraid now the business has grown. Christmas is also very busy, so we don't really. But now I do enjoy the winter.
Yes. Well, we are coming towards the end of winter now.
Yes.
I'm more of a spring person myself, but I mean, there's certainly plenty going on down here most of the year now, and
yes.
Things like the car show that you have here every year. I always bring my kids to that because they love that. So all good. So one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you today is because obviously you've written the book, and as I really enjoyed reading it. There's some quite interesting things in the book, and one that I picked up quite early on is that unlike most autobiographies, you don't begin with your birth. You actually go back and cover the family history of this whole area. And as I understand, that you've been here for something like 95 years, your family. And the book starts about a decade before you were born, when your parents first moved to Hampton Ferry. So can you tell us a little bit about what the place was like back then and how much it's changed over the years?
Well, I can tell you why I've gone back that far. Liz Griffin was the editor of the Evesham Journal. She was asked by the archivists at Worcester County Council to try and find people who could remember or have stories or photos or pictures of 100 years ago. I mean, if in 100 years' time we will be able to know exactly what everybody ate, did, danced when they went out, what they liked, what they didn't like, and certainly all about fashion. But you put the clock back now 100 years and you don't really know. We see pictures and stories, And one of the first things that the archivists realised, that when they looked in the newspapers or or the radios that were there or the stories that were there, it was always done special and everybody was always in their Sunday best. They didn't sort of know what they wore to work and things like that. Obviously we have some idea of some of the programmes that we see about the Dickens's day and the way they lived and that sort of thing. But they wanted to know the ordinary people, and the question they asked Liz, that did she know anybody that could remember a house that didn't have running water, didn't have electric, and obviously with no running water you had a toilet up the garden path, a country privy they call them, I think.
Yes, my grandparents had one.
Yeah. So that was what they were trying to do, and if anybody could actually remember that. Well, yes, I do remember that. But by the time I was born, yes, we did have water. Well, we did have water, and we did have electric, but that wasn't until 1953. I was 10 or 11, so there was a period of time that I can remember that we lived with tiddy lamps and torches and little fairy light, the small lamps that you lit. That there was lots and lots of different things. It was a different life completely to what we get now. I mean, the kids now press buttons to find anything out. I would have had to have gone to the library and looked up at a book to find out some of the things that we want nowadays. But that's where it all started. So Liz came to me. She knew she'd heard me give a talk. When I was Mayor of Evesham, after I'd finished, I was asked to go and talk about my mayor's year, what it entailed, what we did, how we did it, which I did. And I went to several different WIs and different organisations. And then it got that, well, what else can you talk about? And of course, I would then talk about the ferry and living here and being here. Now, so consequently, people would say to me, I hope you've written this down. You know, I hope you've got something, you know, to give your children and things, which I did. And it was mainly for me to have a memoir so that my children would know where they came from. Now, I have 3 sons, and my middle son, James, lives in Australia. He went there 15 years ago. The worst thing about that, I didn't mind him and his wife going, but they took my granddaughter as well. But she's now married, and she has 2 beautiful daughters. And they live in Australia, a completely different life. Couldn't be more different than living here in England. So they're very happy there, and they have a wonderful life, but I wanted something to show them where they came from. So that was really where it started. And Liz came and asked me questions, would I do it for the county archivist? I said, yes, of course I did. So she came sort of once a week for probably virtually 12 months. Would pop in and sort of, we'd just sit and have chat for half an hour and a cup of tea, and that was it. And she recorded it. She would go home. I would write up some of the things and kept going, but I was recording about living at Hampton Ferry. That was the main idea. It wasn't about us personally as a family. It was just us as a family, how we grew with what we had and where we came from. So I told all about my parents moving, and it will have been 95 years this year, 96 years this year. They moved here in 1929.
Wow, that's amazing. And I think what you said there, it's very important that we do preserve and record this social history, because when we think about 100 years ago, really all we have in a lot of cases are a few faded old black and white photographs. And we know a lot about history. We know all about battles and kings and queens, but how the ordinary folk lived is easily lost. Interesting you say about 100 years from now. I wonder if 100 years from now there'll still be someone somewhere listening to this podcast because they want to find out what we did, and maybe even the pictures will be there. So
now just play this record.
Yeah, so that's fascinating. But so my father's the same age as you, and I keep telling him that he needs to do what you've done and record it all, and he hasn't yet, but I'm going to play him this episode and say, look, this is what you need to do.
You
Dad.
really ought to.
So that's good. Okay, in the book you then come on to talk about your childhood, and I was again, like you said about people having to go and find things out or do things, that you were so much more independent and more things that you had to do or could do in those days. And one of the stories I loved in your book was about you and your brother rowing across the floods to go to school when you were 8 years old. Now, can you imagine a child today rowing across the river to go to school? It's a different world. So yeah, I mean, how different do you think perhaps your childhood is to a modern childhood?
Well, my childhood was so different, even to my granddaughter, and to my children and to my granddaughter. I can remember going out for the day in the school holidays. I would have, if I was lucky, I'd carry a bag with a bottle of squash in it, and if I was really lucky, I had a bag of crisps. But otherwise, there'd be sandwiches and a cake. I would go out with my pals in the morning. I didn't come back till night time. My mum and dad didn't know where I was or what I was doing. They weren't worried about it. Their attitude towards looking after a child was different. In that sense. When my granddaughter came, she'd play out here, but my husband or I would watch every step she took. She was never, ever not watched.
Yeah, so I think I was somewhere in between because I grew up in the 1970s, and I think my experience was probably closer to yours than perhaps to your granddaughter's, because we also did still have that freedom.
Yes.
But I'm not sure that it's there now.
No, we had freedom. I mean, I went, we would go, but all my pals would come down and we'd go down the meadows and make dens and do things and climb trees and just do all sorts of things. And when I had a bike, I mean, we went all over the place. That we would go off on a bike, and I can remember Easter time, we would go off and we would go miles. We'd go and pick bluebells and daffodils and things from places where they grew wild, and it was marvellous, and it was just lovely. And restriction, and there was always something to do. Now, as I say, always something to do. The war obviously made a big difference to lots of things, but Christmas for us as children, I think we probably enjoyed it far more than the children do now. Now, my mother, December the 1st, my mother used to get a newspaper up and cut it into strips, and my brother and sister and I, we would sit round the table and we'd paint them different colours in these strips. And once they dried, we'd then stick them together and we'd make chains. Different colours. We decorated every room in the house downstairs. The kitchen, the hallway, the front room, the dining room. We decorated it with flowers. And always on Christmas Eve, my dad would come in with mistletoe and holly and hang that up round with all the chains. And it was lovely. We enjoyed it. We did it. Now, we didn't have television. We didn't have radio. Well, we had radio, but we used to have to fill the radio battery thing. It was a cylinder thing that I would take on the way to school to be charged to Mr. Godwin. We had the bike shop in Vine Street. Take him that and pick him up on the way home. And we had 3 or 4 of these so that Mum and Dad could listen to the radio. But it wasn't the same. And I mean, we went to bed early just because it was dark and there was no light and nothing else really to do but go to bed. Always at Christmas, one thing that was in our stocking was a torch, so that we could read in bed with a torch. I mean, that was great. We got another torch, and doing things. At Christmas was fun, but I think probably part of the fun is that after Christmas, we take all those decorations down, nail on the fire, and we toast marshmallows while they burned. They were sort of silly sort of memories. But as a family, we did it. I mean, I don't know, well, families do it, but now they play games and do things, and even then some children don't like playing Monopoly or Cluedo or whatever else is. A different way of life.
No, we do. We did try playing Monopoly at Christmas, but it always seems to end in an argument.
I mean, it's gone very, very commercialised.
People hiding £500 notes under the board.
Never did that.
I guess Christmas perhaps doesn't have quite that magical feel about
Yeah,
it.
and it was magical.
yeah.
I mean, we believed in Father Christmas and everything, you know, and I mean, and it just was. And we got all excited about painting these strips of paper. We didn't have fancy decorations and the lovely ones and things that we got now. I mean, they're beautiful now, and some of the Christmas trees that we do, that we have, are fantastic.
I guess a lot of people don't make their own decorations now. I mean, I remember making the ones that you, similar to what you talked about when we were kids, but we did, I think we did buy them. They were like strips of gummed paper, different colours, green, blue, red, and you sort of licked, they were like stamps. And you licked it, and once you'd done, a few yards of them, your tongue was like the bottom of a budgie cage. But
there were just all sorts of things in my childhood. I mean, Father was a nurseryman. I think he must have had the very first garden centre anybody ever had, except that we didn't call him that then. But he grew plants and did things when he came to the ferry, and I used to love it. One of my favourite flowers is a geranium. Yep. Now, they don't smell very nice, geraniums, but I can remember very, very clearly sitting on the side in the greenhouse with my dad when he would pull up his geraniums and cut them all and trim them all down and take cuttings. And my job was to dip them in the powder for them before he could plant them. And it was very important, and I used to line them up in sizes because some were 2 inches and some were only 1 inch. That's what I did, so that he replanted the geraniums. And I still do it every year, and I always think of my dad.
Wow. Okay, so that was your childhood.
Yeah. Well,
and then obviously you grew up and got married, and you became involved in local politics, eventually serving as mayor. So tell us a little bit about how that came about and what that experience was like.
Came about, I'm going to say, it's crazy. I really never ever had any interest in politics whatsoever. It never ever occurred to me things went on and did and whatever. I met my husband whilst on holiday in France, and we got married 2 years later, and we had, we actually had 4 children, 4 boys, but my third son, sadly, very sadly, was drowned here at Evesham. It was a very, very sad day. And after that, I was very angry because we used to take the children swimming to teach them to swim. When I was a child, one of the first things I had to do was learn to swim. And I think I learned to swim virtually before I could walk. That was, one of the things. Now, our children were treated exactly the same, except that in the winter I couldn't take them to the swim baths. We used to go once a week to either Tewkesbury or Cheltenham swimming baths and take the kids, teach them. If there'd have been a swimming pool in Evesham, then I would have gone 2 or 3 times a day. I mean, it was a major event, taking 3 kids swimming. It was 3-4 hours by the time you got there and got that and whatever. So that was it, that when we lost Scott, at that particular time, there was an organisation in Evesham called VESPA, the Vale of Evesham Swimming Pool Association. They were fighting like mad to get a swimming pool built in Evesham. Now, after we lost Scott, I said that I would do everything to stop another mother having to go through what I'd been through, or a family to endure that, which I did. Prior to that, I'd obviously, when we first got married, my husband and I, we came back. I lived in Scotland for a very short time, but I came back here, and we were partners in the business with Mum and Dad. And yes, we worked here and we did the ferry. And one of the local bank managers asked me if I'd like to join the Chamber of Commerce. Would I be interested in it? And I did. I went probably 3 or 4 time meetings just prior to my son dying. And when he did, they were very, very supportive. And they, realised that more children would have learnt to swim at his age. I mean, he was only 3, but for whatever. And so then I became involved with VESPA. And from VESPA, there was a gentleman who used to come over the ferry every day, George Ems. He was a reporter for the Evesham Journal. He lived in Hampton and he would come over the ferry and go to work, which was fine. And the one day he said to me, he says, "Why don't you stand for council?" I said, "Because I don't know anything about council. I don't know a darn thing. There's just nothing. It's not, I'm not particularly interested in. I mean, I know who the mayor is, and that was nearly it." And he says, "Well, I reckon you'd do well." So he said, I'll do it. I said, "Well, I don't know where to start. What if you want to be a councillor, what do you have to do?" He said, "Well, when there's an election, you have to fill in a form and say that you want to be a councillor. You have to get it signed by probably 5 or 6 people to say that they think you're capable of being a councillor. And then that was it, you take it on." And the silly part, George did everything. He got the form, he filled it in and everything, and I just signed it and did it. And there was an election coming up in November. Then he came and he said, "You will need to go round knocking on doors." I said, "I don't want to do that." He said, "Well, no, I'm sorry." He said, "But you will. You've got to let people know." Now, the ferry at that time was much more popular than it is now, just simply because there were less cars and vehicles, and it was a shortcut into town for the people living in Hampton. So the council seat was in Hampton, and he said, "A lot of them will know you." So that was it. So I went with George knocking on doors, and he introduced me, and they look at me and say, "Oh yeah, I know you. You're Ernie Huxley's daughter. I know you. You're Wellesley's sister. I know you. You're John's mum. I know you. You're Sam's wife." Nobody knew me. They only knew me in relation to somebody else. I came home furious, absolutely hopping mad. I said, "That's it. I'm going to try and get on so that people will learn and know me."
Yeah.
And literally that is what I did. And I was very fortunate that I actually got on the council and was on it for 35 years and thoroughly enjoyed it. And I would like to think that on 1 or 2 places I left me mark, but I could have probably done a lot better, but on the other hand I could have done worse. So I enjoyed very much. But I'm still not a political animal. Politics, I don't know. I won't say they don't interest me. They do interest me. But I can see whichever flavour of the month you want to be, Liberal, Labour or Conservative or whatever, they've all got good things going for them. They all got good ideas. I often think, well, why can't we just all pick out the good ideas and use them? Why have we got to vote according to Conservatives or according to Labour or Liberal? But anyways, I always stood as independent. And yes, I mean, that was it. And Evesham was really all that I cared about. The town and the people living in it.
Yeah. Well, I guess as an independent, you can concentrate more on local issues and you aren't bound by party politics to have to vote a certain way. Yeah. So I could, certainly if I ever went down that route, that would be what I would do.
Yeah.
So that's great. So, okay. So you must have seen some enormous changes throughout your life. I mean, we've already talked about when you first came here and the outside toilets and such. But just talking about Evesham and the local area, what would you say have been some of the most significant transformations that you've seen?
Transformations. I mean, I love Evesham. First, last and foremost, always in my book. But times change and things change, and I think one of the saddest change that I personally think was when I was a child, next door to us was Les State, who was a great dahlia and chrysanthemum grower. Now, years later, when I was on the council and the council were invited to twin with Evesham in New Jersey in America, we actually went to America and we did twin with Evesham, New Jersey. But what amazed me was that whilst we were there, they took us to the Philadelphia Flower Show. And at the Philadelphia Flower Show, Les State from next door had got his dahlias and chrysanthemums and this sort of thing. I don't think he was there, we didn't know him. But they were very impressed that I knew about dahlias and flowers and things like that. Now that's gone.
Yeah.
That was people in Philadelphia knew about a flower grower in Evesham, which I think was, pretty wonderful. I mean, and other times when you've been travelling, they talk about Worcester sauce and different things. And over the years, a lot of things. I know there was a lot of argy-bargy because they said that Eccles cakes could only come from Eccles. This is the sort of thing they wanted. Now, Angela Tidmarsh from the Wych District Council, who is the tourism officer there, she just retired actually, but when she was there, she got asparagus registered as being from Evesham.
Yeah.
And she would jump up and down madly if she went into a shop and they weren't selling asparagus, British asparagus, but particularly Evesham. And of course we've got within a Defford, which is near enough, it's in the Vale, the largest asparagus grower in the country. That he grows red, purple, green and white asparagus, but got 80 odd acres of asparagus. He is the biggest grower, and that's in Evesham.
Yeah, Evesham is famous for asparagus.
Yes, yeah. And just is. We used to cut asparagus when I was a kid. I hated the asparagus season because we had to get up so early in the morning to cut it. But yes, I do love asparagus as such. And yes, and there's so many things that have changed. Our whole lives have changed. Now, I remember my granddad, on my mother's side, he looked after horses for a doctor in the late 1800s, 1880, 19 sort of thing. And then the doctor bought a car. So Grandad was out of job. That was change. That's a dramatic change for your job to be no longer there. Not just, going to somebody else to do the same sort of work. It just didn't exist. Now, also, my husband's name, Raphael, my sister traced the ancestors back to see what they did and established that they came from Dumfries in Scotland and that they were comb makers. Now you think, now about a comb, well, either plastic or metal or whatever, easy enough to make a comb, but in those days they're made from tortoise shells or seashells. It was a very, very skilled job.
Yeah.
And non-existent now. So there's lots and lots of things that have changed. And okay, at the Evesham Industrial Estate we had Evesham Computers, which is really way up to date and sort of 60, 70 years ago wouldn't have been needed, wouldn't even know what we were talking about.
Yeah.
That things do change and everything changes. I laugh and smile. Everybody now, you see kids walking around, people walking around with a phone in their hand.
It's one of my pet hates.
And mine.
Yeah.
Recently, I was down in the cafe and there was a party for Grandma. It was her birthday. And there were obviously her sons and daughters and their children. And there were about 7 or 8 children that were, I would say, between 9 and 16, so that sort of age. They're all sitting on one table and they are all sitting with their phone in their hand looking at it. And I'm walking round and I said, why don't you just talk to each other? This one kid says, we are.
Yeah.
And they were using the phone. They're sitting there round the table. But they're...
Yeah, you see it all the time. And also people walking down the street or having conversations.
Yeah.
Thankfully, my youngest son is almost taking a backlash against this, and he's 14. He hasn't got a phone yet, and he's the only one in his class that hasn't, and he's quite proud of that. And he goes out and he plays football, and he goes out on his bikes, and I'm quite happy about that.
Yes,
he hasn't fallen into that trap. Hopefully he won't.
Yeah,
So,
well,
and we
hopefully
have
you will.
conversations. We go out for walks. We walk all around here, and
Yeah.
we don't even take our phones with us. So we're
Yes.
just completely off the grid.
Yeah.
In some ways, thankfully, when I grew up, I was probably the last generation that still experienced that, because we were just before computers
Yeah.
and the internet.
Yeah.
So, but it is still possible to do.
Yeah, but life is different. And I'm quite surprised actually by how many people are interested in history.
Yeah.
That they do want to know how people lived and how people did things. I mean, the Almond Room Museum is a wonderful asset to Evesham, absolutely all along the way, and is a beautiful place to go to, and you can pick up and learn and do. And it really is quite funny. When the BBC were very, very first opening, no, I'll start before, we had a programme on the television, on the Brian Johnson, Down Your Way,
Yes.
that was
I
on
remember
the
Brian
radio, and he came a long time ago, and he to do the ferry, to see the ferry, and he came down and how long it had been here, why it had been here, what did we do, and all the rest of it, which he did, and you chose a music to play and all this. Well, when he came and he interviewed us, my father and I, and he said, at the end of the programme, he said, I'm going to say it's the only rope ferry in the world. And I said, well, you can't say that because we don't know that it is. He said, well, I'm going to say it anyway, and I can guarantee that if it isn't, we shall be inundated. That people will tell us that it isn't the only rope ferry in the world. Anyway, it went out the programme, and that's what we did, and fine. 6 or 7 weeks after the programme had gone out, Brian Johnson phoned up, and he said, we haven't had one single murmur that there is another rope ferry in the world.
Wow.
He said, so I'm taking that there is. So at that time, we just bought a van for the work to do all our running around with and shopping and everything for the business. And on the side of it, we put Hampton Ferry, the only rope ferry in the world, on the side of the van, quite merrily. And several years later, when BBC Radio in Hereford and Worcester was opening at Worcester, the investigative journalist came and spoke to us, and they said, you're the only rope ferry in the world. He said, can you prove it? I said, can you prove we're not?
Yeah. So they haven't.
And
have they ever found another?
No, and the girl there, she laughed, and she said, well, I'll try and prove it. She spent almost a week, apparently, trying to find another rope ferry, and she couldn't, and she didn't.
That's fascinating. So what do you think makes it so unique? Why has no one else copied the idea?
Yeah, well, it's silly because at Stratford there's a ferry, and it's a chain all the way. Now, where the chain goes into the water and onto the riverbed is probably 4, maybe 5 feet, which with a wheel you can pick that chain up and take it over, and it's not very heavy. Like
Okay.
you can go over it and you can
Yeah.
do it, and you can you can take the ferry. The mechanism works that you can just wind the handle and take you across without having the ferry over the top, river over the top. Here, where the ferry river rope crosses the river, it's about 18 feet deep. And one time my dad we had gardens this side the river, and he was doing the gardens, but if a boat came to go past the ferry rope, he would have to go from this side to the other side to drop the rope, then wind it back up, come back and do the gardening again. And there was a man who had a metal works in Birmingham. I can't remember the name of them now. But he said to me, you've wasted an awful lot of time going backwards and forwards over to drop the rope for the boats going by. Why don't you have a ferry like a rope like they've got at Stratford? And Dad said, I can't have one like that. He said, because it's too strong. He said, I'll try and do that. I'll sort something out. Dad said, I'll tell you what, you sort something out, and if I can do the ferry, I'll pay you for it. Fair enough. And he went, well, yeah, that's fine. So a few months later he came. I've got you everything, and he got a big wheel and another cog and a whatever and a thing like that. And he got the chain and all the set, and he put it all up. And then he said, Dad, that's it, I set it up. He says, you can now do the ferry. So Dad gets in the boat and he starts winding the chain. It was that heavy, and it took him 10 minutes to get across the river, and he was exhausted when he got to the other side. He said, I'm sorry. He said, that is just not practical. You know, the monks put the ferry there with a rope. So, you know, that is what they did. Well, they might have had a chain when they first did it, because there wasn't the traffic going up and down the river. It was only when the boat traffic increased. I mean, at one time, the salt coming from Droitwich and all this sort of thing would come here to go to the place in Evesham, just above the old bridge. That it was just silly. So it was impractical. So we still have a rope ferry.
And just remind me, how long has it actually been there?
It is mentioned in the Doomsday Book.
Wow.
In the 11th century.
Incredible.
The ferry. So and the monks, we know that the Evesham Abbey was built in 704, and that the fertile soil and the area had everything. You could grow whatever you like. My dad used to say you could plant a match and it'd grow, and because it was so fertile, they had everything they wanted. You know, pigs, horses, goats, and sheep, and all the vegetables and everything they wanted. The only thing they hadn't got was the wine, which, of course, the monks would like in their church services and whatever.
Absolutely.
And the hill over there would be ideal for a vineyard. So, if you look at the aerial view of Evesham, it goes round in a big horseshoe.
Yeah.
The town lives in the horseshoe. And the monks were there, and they'd got to go over the old bridge, which was the only way across the river then. We're talking 700, whatever. And then it would be a long walk, probably nearly 2-3 miles, to walk all the way round Hampton to go to tend the vineyards. That they got the vineyard and did. So when they did, they decided that it would be a good idea if they had a ferry here, so that the monks was all on this sort of side. They could just go down there and be at work. And they built the foundations of the ferry house. And there's a big cellar, the ground floor, and there's two floors downstairs and 2 up. And that we assumed that was for the monks to live upstairs, 2 monks to there, and they actually made the wine downstairs and stored it down below in the cellar. And there's a stream that comes from Clark's Hill that runs and still runs underneath the house and into the river. And it's in the cellar and comes through. I mean, that was from
amazing.
All those years ago.
It's clearly, it's a significant part of our heritage, the ferry. And
yes.
One that I would hope would be preserved for future generations. But looking ahead, I mean, what do you think the future is, particularly, for example, now that we've got this new footbridge being built across the river? Is there always going to be a place for Hampton Ferry?
I would like to think so. I find it quite incredible, and I should probably get into trouble for saying this. Several years ago, a man came to speak to Robbie and I. We were both councillors for Hampton, and they wanted to build the new houses that are going up at the top of Hampton, going way to Hinton. Their plan was for 800 houses. And would we object? He came to see us as councillors.
Yep.
And of course we sat there and talked to him and chatted to him. And at the end of the sort of conversation, he said, by the way, when a developer comes and does something like this in an area that is eventually going to be so big, they were going to do 200 houses at a time, it's going to be big, they usually do something for the community. Have you got a community centre? Have you got a thing? And at that particular time, the cupboard at Hampton had just been rebuilt and done, so there wasn't a need for that sort of a thing. And of course, I said to him, well, yeah, I'd like a foot ferry, a foot bridge to come over by the ferry. He said, you can't do that. You can't do away with the ferry. I said, I'm not going to do away with the ferry. I said, but we can't physically open for 24 hours a day. But a footbridge could. And it turns out that he lived in Evesham until he was 16, and then his parents moved to London, and he was now working for this big business. And he came, he said, well, I used to be a ferry boy, you can't take the job off me. and he was worried that, I would think at one time nearly every child in Hampton had a job on the ferry. My parents learnt very, very early on that if you did it all the time yourself, then you didn't get anything else done. But if you could pay somebody to do the ferry, Dad was always here working on his plants and doing, there was never they weren't unattended. So they used to always employ at least 21 ferry boys, 3 hours a day for 7 days a week, wow. Which was what they did. And Dad would say, well, if anybody was off sick or on holiday, then he'd only got to do the ferry for 3 hours instead of all day. And even at that, then there were always other kids willing to step in and do the ferry for somebody else, just so they'd have 2 shifts. And I found it incredible that when my parents celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, we had Mum and Dad, we just built the new cafe. And my parents said, we'll have open house, we'll invite everybody to come. And they put a story in the journal that if there were any of the old ferry boys who would like to come and see Mr. and Mrs. Huxley, then please do. And we were flabbergasted at how many came. There were loads and loads, and it was lovely. But one man in particular, Stan Ray, he was a lovely, lovely man. And he came and he said he'd been evacuated to Evesham as a 13-year-old boy and was here for 2 years during the war. He always wanted to go and be a soldier and do something, but he was obviously too young. But he got a job on the ferry, 3-hour shift or whatever that. And he said, and when I was little, he said, I was always asking questions. I was always saying, why? Why do you do that? Why do you do that? And whatever. He said, and during my visit and living, he used to visit Mum and Dad regularly, but he said during that 2 years, the only people that would ever answer me and give me a reason as to why were Mr. and Mrs. Huxley, my mum and dad. And he said, that has stuck with me all my life. And he now had a very important job. He was one of the instigators of tannoy systems. He travelled all over the world and everything. And he came to us here in the cafe on that day for Mum and Dad's golden wedding. And he said, thank you to them for listening to a nosy little boy. He said, I must have drove him mad. But yes, it's so the ferry, I think, has influenced an awful lot of people in their attitude to things. And several of the boys that came that were now men and got families, they all said the same. They said we had a certain amount of independence when we got they were glad to earn a little bit of money. Yeah. It wasn't a great deal, probably £1 an hour or something like that. But that was theirs. He said, but Mr. Huxley taught us that we must be prompt. We couldn't be late. And that if we were late, the person who was already on the ferry had to stay, and they weren't very happy. He said, so that was one thing that we learned, was you must be on time. Yeah. And you must do things. And the only thing that we ever said to anybody that came to do the ferry, you must be able to swim. So, that was the ferry. And the way, and so many people used to use it. You say changing times. We now take our children to school in a bus. They used to come over the ferry years ago. And my father, I always say, my father very rarely left the place. He didn't go anywhere. He didn't like going on holidays, and he didn't. The only thing he did was fish. He would travel on a Thursday to go fishing somewhere else, but otherwise he was always here. But he always knew what was going on. He'd speak to people coming over the ferry. He knew all the news and who'd done what to who and where they'd done it and why. It was really quite incredible. Incredible.
Long may it continue.
Yes.
Well, that's been fascinating. We've only barely touched on everything that's in your book. But tell people who are listening, because having read it, I can promise everyone there are so many more anecdotes in there. Where can they buy your book?
Well, they can buy it at Raphael's, the restaurant, the cafe. They could email me and I will willingly post them one to it. And it's on sale at Amazon. I must confess I don't know how or why, but yes, I'm sure that's something to do with Liz Griffin. Yes, and they can buy the book and things. And I realise now that I haven't put half the things in. As far as I was concerned, what I was doing then was writing about Hampton Ferry. But there's such a lot of things that, because we lived at Hampton Ferry, we did other things and spread. My brother, sister and I did other things and whatever, and there's more that I should have said about what we achieved between us.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, I hope everyone's enjoyed that. Please, if you're listening, do like and follow our podcast, and feel free to feedback on anything you've heard. Keep an eye on us on the Evesham notice board where we post each new episode. All that's left for me to say is thank you very much, Diana. It has been absolutely fascinating, and thank you for inviting us to your home.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And I'm sure people are going to love the podcast. So thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you.